It began with a scream no one believed was real. Neighbors said they thought it was the television. A woman alone in her kitchen clutching her stomach as something inside her body broke apart. The lights flickered, her phone was dead, and for a moment she thought she was dying. Her name was Mary Ellen Coates, and in 1978 she was known in the small Ohio town of Fairvale as the woman who never left her house. Some called her strange, others called her cursed. No one called her a mother. But that night, she gave birth on her kitchen floor to a child she didn't know existed. There were no prenatal visits, no swollen belly, no missed cycles. The doctors later said her mind had walled off the pregnancy, a kind of dissociation born from trauma. But people who lived on her street told another story. They whispered about the baby that shouldn't have been born, and the house that never stopped crying after that night. What the town didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that Mary's body had hidden more than a pregnancy. It had hidden a secret that stretched back 3 generations, a secret of shame, silence, and bloodlines that folded in on themselves. For weeks, she told people she'd found the baby on her doorstep. She wrapped it in towels and said it was a miracle, a sign from God. But behind closed doors, she trembled when she looked into the child's eyes, because those eyes didn't belong to a stranger. They belonged to someone she once loved, someone who was supposed to be dead. And when investigators finally uncovered the truth about who the father was, it wasn't a story about medicine anymore. It was about memory, denial, and the kind of horror that only exists inside the human mind. Because Mary Ellen Coates wasn't just a woman who didn't know she was pregnant, she was a woman who refused to remember how she became that way. And once you hear what really happened in that house on Maple Hollow Road, you'll understand why no one in Fairvale ever spoke her name again. They found her a day later, barefoot, sitting on the kitchen floor, holding the baby like she was afraid it would vanish if she blinked. The neighbors said she looked hollow, like she hadn't slept in years. Blood trailed across the linoleum, pooling beneath her legs, yet she just kept whispering, "He came back. He came back." When the ambulance arrived, Mary didn't fight them. She stared out the window as they carried her away, the child in another pair of hands. The baby didn't cry. The paramedics said it was the quietest delivery they'd ever seen. But that silence, that eerie, unnatural calm, would become the first clue that something about this birth wasn't right. Doctors ran tests. They said the child was healthy, but they couldn't explain the anomalies, blood type mismatches, traces of an older genetic condition that didn't appear in Mary's medical history. They didn't know how to tell her that the DNA results were impossible. Mary was questioned repeatedly. She couldn't recall being with anyone. She swore she hadn't left her home in years, but when police searched her property, they found footprints, men's boots, pressed deep into the mud behind her house. They led straight to the cellar door. Inside, everything was damp, the air heavy with mold and something metallic. The officers described a smell like rust or decay. And in the corner, half buried beneath old furniture, they found what looked like a cot, a child's cot. It had been there for years. When investigators returned the next day, the cot was gone. So was Mary. The hospital claimed she discharged herself, but no one saw her leave. One nurse said she woke to the sound of humming, an old lullaby, and saw Mary's hospital gown folded neatly at the edge of the bed. Weeks passed, then months, and the child, the one no one claimed, was placed into foster care. Records say the boy grew up quiet, detached, and strange. He would sit in the corner of classrooms and draw the same thing over and over again. A small house with a woman inside. Sometimes he'd add a figure standing at the door, staring in. When asked who it was, he'd always answer the same way. "That's my father. He lives under the floor." The county tried to bury it, the story, the files, the photographs. But in small towns, truth never really dies. It just waits for someone desperate enough to dig it back up. And someone did. In 1992, a reporter named Samuel Price began researching unsolved rural disappearances in Ohio. He found a pattern: multiple women from the same family line vanishing across generations. Each one, from Mary Ellen back to her grandmother, had been institutionalized, accused of delusion or hysteria. Each one described the same figure, a man they called the Visitor. The deeper Price looked, the stranger it got. He found medical records that didn't add up. Mary's mother, Ruth Coates, had supposedly died in childbirth in 1949, yet her body was never found. There were notes from an attending nurse who claimed the child survived, but was not right. That note was crossed out in red ink, stamped void. Price managed to track down one surviving relative, Mary's uncle, living in a care home. The man barely spoke, his hands shaking constantly, eyes wide like someone who'd seen too much. When asked about Mary, he said only this: "She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. That family's been feeding itself for years." Price thought it was metaphor, the decay of a bloodline, the way trauma breeds trauma. But when he looked at the DNA records from Mary's case, something cold settled in his gut. The infant's father and grandfather shared identical genetic markers. The child was not just born of Mary's body, he was born of the same blood that had created her. A generational loop repeating itself in silence, hidden beneath layers of shame, secrecy, and rural isolation. When Price tried to publish the story, the paper shut him down. He received letters with no return address. One said, "You think you've found the truth, but that house still stands, and it's still hungry." Prick. He visited Maple Hollow Road one final time. The property was condemned, but he described hearing sounds inside. A low rhythm, like something breathing behind the walls. He left before sunset, his notes unfinished, his voice recorder blank. That night he crashed his car on Route 7. The police report said he swerved to avoid something in the road, something small, pale, moving on all fours. Years passed, and the town forgot, or pretended to. The house on Maple Hollow Road rotted in silence, swallowed by weeds and time. Children dared each other to throw stones at the windows, but none ever reached the porch. They said you could hear something crawling just beneath the floorboards if you stood too close. In 2003, construction crews arrived to clear the land for a new housing development. The company records show they didn't stay long. Within hours of breaking ground, one worker fell ill, violent tremors, incoherent speech, a sudden fever that spiked to 107 degrees. He said he'd unearthed a box. Inside were cloth scraps, photographs, and human teeth wrapped in newspaper dated 1978. The box disappeared before authorities arrived. The site was shut down, labeled unstable soil. But the foreman, a man named Reuben Glass, told his wife something that never made it into any report. He said he'd seen someone standing at the tree line, a woman, barefoot, her hair matted and long, holding a bundle close to her chest. When he shouted, she stepped backward into the woods and vanished. Weeks later, Reuben's wife found their bedroom window open, the sheets dragged toward the floor. There was mud on the sill and the faint sound of humming in the distance, the same lullaby the nurse had mentioned 25 years earlier. Rumors spread again. Some said Mary had returned. Others believed the child, now grown, had come home, but no one went to find out. Then one night, a fire broke out on the property. By morning, the entire foundation was ash. The firefighters who responded said it didn't smell like wood or gasoline. It smelled like burnt flesh. When the flames died, they found something impossible. Beneath the wreckage, perfectly untouched, sat a single photograph. A black and white image of a woman in a kitchen holding a newborn in her arms. Both were staring at the camera. But the walls behind her weren't from the 1970s. They were modern, freshly painted, lined with power outlets and plastic switches that didn't exist in that decade. Someone had taken the picture recently, someone who wanted the town to remember what it tried to forget. And for those who lived near Maple Hollow, The nightmares began again. They always started the same way: a quiet house, a crying baby, and a woman's voice whispering, "He came back." By 2008, the legend of Mary Ellen Coates had become folklore. Teenagers filmed videos on their phones near the old property, laughing, daring each other to summon the woman who didn't know. Most of those clips vanished after upload, deleted, corrupted, or simply untraceable. One, however, survived. It showed a boy walking into the woods at dusk. He's holding a flashlight, joking nervously to his friends behind the camera. They follow him to what looks like the foundation of the burned house. The camera pans, catches something pale on the ground, a scrap of cloth, maybe a hospital gown. Then there's a sound, a low, rattling breath. The boy turns, flashlight shaking, and the image freezes. The last frame captures a figure standing behind him. A woman, head tilted, eyes black with shadow, holding what looks like a child, or something shaped like one. The video ends there. The boy in it, identified later as 17-year-old Caleb Rooker, disappeared that same night. The local sheriff dismissed it all as hysteria, saying the tape was doctored. But his deputy, who logged the evidence, quit 2 days later. He told his wife, "That wasn't edited, I saw her blink." And so, the story buried itself again, but the question remained: how does a woman's body hide a pregnancy? How does her mind erase the memory of its own creation? Doctors call it cryptic pregnancy, a psychological dissociation where the body conceals every sign. But in Mary's case, it went beyond biology. It was as if her body itself had obeyed her fear, keeping the child secret, protecting her from remembering the one thing she could never face. The father wasn't an outsider, he wasn't a stranger, he was blood, and if the rumors from the Coates family tree were true, he might not have been entirely alive when it happened. Sometimes, trauma doesn't just live in memory, it reshapes the flesh that came in. Rise it. It hides in DNA, echoing forward, turning pain into inheritance. When they finally tested the soil where Mary's house once stood, the results came back strange. High levels of calcium, phosphorus, and hemoglobin, human by composition, but scattered too evenly, too deeply, as if something had bled through the ground for decades. Some called it a haunting, others a curse. But those who studied it came to a darker conclusion, that Mary hadn't just given birth that night in 1978. She had passed something on. It's easy to dismiss stories like this, to label them folklore, hysteria, rural madness. But the further you trace the paper trail, the harder it becomes to separate myth from documentation, because the state archives still hold a file marked Confidential M.E. Coates. Inside it are photographs, medical charts, a single note written in an unsteady hand: "He will come through me again." Experts say the handwriting matches Mary's, written sometime after her disappearance, but the ink analysis dates the note to 1986, 8 years after she was last seen. People who've read the file describe it as cursed. One archivist claimed her vision blurred every time she tried to scan the pages. Another said she heard faint breathing in her office late at night, right before the power went out. The file was moved to cold storage, marked restricted access. And then, quietly, something else happened. A new birth record appeared in the same county, no father listed, no hospital record. The mother's name, Ellen M. Coates. Born 2008. The same year Caleb disappeared. Some believe it was coincidence, a clerical error. Others think it was something cyclical, repeating itself like a ritual encoded in blood. But one fact remains: the name Coates keeps returning every 30 years, like clockwork. If you visit Fairvale today, you won't find the house. You'll find a patch of land the locals refuse to buy. Grass never grows there, and when the wind hits just right, it carries a sound, a faint, rhythmic lullaby, almost mechanical in tone. They say it's the sound of a woman humming to her child, trying to keep him quiet. Others swear it's the earth itself, mourning what it was forced to hold. And maybe that's the real horror here. Not the screaming, not the blood, but the silence that follows, the generations who inherit what no one dares to name. Because trauma has a way of pretending to die, when in truth, it just changes its face. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Sometimes the most terrifying part of the story is realizing it isn't finished. A researcher named Dr. Leonard Pike was the last person known to open the Coates file. A forensic genealogist by trade, he specialized in tracing mutations passed through isolated family lines. In 2017, he requested access to the sealed records, claiming he was studying genetic echoes of generational trauma. What he found made him abandon his entire field within the year. Pike's notes were later found in his university office, scattered across the floor, soaked from a burst radiator. Most of the ink had run, but a few words survived. Phrases like, "line never broke," "birth without conception," and "something still gestating." His final entry read, "It's not the body that gives birth, it's the memory." 2 weeks later, Pike vanished on his way home from Fairvale. His car was discovered on the shoulder of Route 7, engine running, headlights still on. In the passenger seat sat a file folder labeled Coates Ellen, 2008. Inside were ultrasound images, but they weren't of a fetus. They were of something shaped like a hand pressing against the uterine wall, as if reaching back. When law enforcement traced the source of those images, they led to a closed clinic 50 miles outside town. The building was abandoned, yet the machines inside were still running. The power still worked. On one of the monitors, frozen mid-frame, was a grainy figure of a woman sitting upright, her mouth open in a scream that made no sound. To this day, Pike's disappearance remains unsolved. The county lists it as lost in transit. The file was sealed again, this time under federal order. Locals say that every few years someone new comes looking. A filmmaker, a podcaster, a historian. They always start the same way, curious, skeptical, convinced it's just another backwoods ghost story. They always leave something behind, a tape, a journal, a photo, and in each there's the same sound served somewhere in the background. A low hum, a lullaby. The same one that began in that kitchen in 1978. The story of Mary Ellen Coates isn't a story at all. It's a pattern, a wound passed from one generation to the next, too deep to heal, too old to name. And maybe that's why her name still lingers in whispers and half-buried documents, because the truth isn't about one woman or one child. It's about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried and decides instead to be born again.